In the annals of human history, there are moments that shine so brightly they seem to defy the very nature of conflict. Moments that remind us of our shared humanity, even when the world around us seems consumed by hatred and destruction. The Christmas Truce of 1914 is one such extraordinary chapter, a story that whispers hope into the thunderous roar of war, a testament to the incredible power of compassion that resides within the human spirit. Imagine a world torn apart. The year is 1914, and Europe stands at the precipice of what would become the most devastating conflict humanity had ever witnessed. The Great War, as it would later be known, was supposed to be a quick, glorious adventure. Young men from various nations, filled with patriotic fervor and romantic notions of heroism, marched eagerly towards what they believed would be a brief, triumphant campaign. But reality was brutally different. The Western Front stretched like an open wound across Belgium and France, a complex network of trenches that would become a symbol of human suffering. Soldiers from Germany, Britain, France, and other nations found themselves trapped in a hellish landscape of mud, blood, and constant terror. These were not just soldiers, but sons, fathers, brothers, friends, young men who just months earlier were living ordinary lives, now forced into an extraordinary and horrific circumstance. The roots of the conflict traced back to a complex web of diplomatic tensions, imperial ambitions, and a delicate balance of power that had existed in Europe for decades. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo on June 28, 1914, was the spark that ignited this powder keg. What followed was a cascading series of diplomatic crises and military mobilizations that transformed a regional conflict into a global catastrophe. By August 1914, the major European powers had been drawn into what would become the first truly industrialized war in human history. The old romantic notions of warfare, cavalry charges, honorable combat, swift victories, were quickly shattered by the brutal realities of modern weaponry. Machine guns, artillery, poison gas, and new technologies of destruction transformed battlefields into landscapes of unimaginable horror. The German Schlieffen Plan, designed to quickly defeat France before turning to fight Russia, had failed. The initial German advance was halted, and both sides began digging extensive trench systems. These were not temporary fortifications but complex underground cities that stretched hundreds of miles. Soldiers lived, fought, and often died within these narrow, muddy corridors. Trenches were more than just military positions. They were microcosms of human endurance. On the Western Front, British, French, and Belgian troops faced off against German forces across a no-man's land that was often just a few hundred yards wide. This narrow strip of terrain, churned by artillery and littered with barbed wire and the remnants of human suffering, became a symbol of the war's senselessness. The soldiers who occupied these trenches came from diverse backgrounds. They were farmers, factory workers, students, and craftsmen, young men who had been swept up in a conflict they barely understood. Many were barely out of their teens, thrust into a world of constant danger, where death could come from a sniper's bullet, an artillery shell, or the countless diseases that plagued trench warfare. Daily life in the trenches was a grotesque mixture of extreme boredom and sudden, terrifying violence. Soldiers dealt with constant dampness, rats, lice, and the psychological toll of waiting for the next attack. They formed tight bonds with their fellow soldiers, understanding that survival depended on mutual support and camaraderie. The winter of 1914 was particularly harsh. Temperatures dropped below freezing, and soldiers on both sides suffered from inadequate clothing and limited provisions. The mud became frozen, the ground became treacherous, and the human cost of the war became increasingly apparent. It was in this context of shared misery and exhaustion that an extraordinary event would unfold, a moment of humanity that would become legendary. To truly understand the Christmas Truce, we must look beyond the grand narratives of generals and politicians. The real protagonists were the ordinary soldiers, young men who, despite being told they were enemies, recognized a fundamental shared humanity. On the German side, many soldiers came from rural backgrounds, with strong Christian traditions. They brought with them memories of Christmas celebrations, of family gatherings, and of peace. Young men like Wilhelm Priester, a 23-year-old soldier from Saxony, represented the typical German infantryman, conscripted, hoping to serve his country, but also carrying deep personal hopes and fears. The British Expeditionary Force was composed of professional soldiers and early volunteers. Men like Bruce Bairnsfather, an artist and soldier who would later become famous for his illustrations of trench life, captured the complex emotional landscape of soldiers during this period. These were not just fighting men, but individuals with rich inner lives, capable of empathy and spontaneous acts of kindness. French soldiers, fighting to defend their homeland against what they saw as German invasion, carried their own complex mix of patriotism and war weariness. Many came from agricultural regions, bringing with them a deep sense of community and shared suffering that would ultimately contribute to the extraordinary events of Christmas 1914. Critically, these soldiers were not abstract entities but real human beings with families, hopes, and fears. They understood, perhaps more intimately than their commanders, the true cost of the conflict. They saw each other not as faceless enemies, but as fellow human beings caught in an incomprehensible machine of destruction. The Western Front in 1914 was not a singular, continuous battle but a complex, dynamic environment of constant small-scale engagements, artillery bombardments, and periods of tense waiting. The terrain itself was a formidable enemy, muddy, churned by constant shelling, filled with abandoned equipment, and littered with the tragic remnants of human conflict. Trench warfare had created a bizarre, almost surreal landscape. Trenches were not neat, linear structures but complex systems with multiple lines of defense. The frontline trench was the most dangerous, constantly exposed to enemy fire. Behind it were support trenches and reserve trenches, creating a deep, interconnected network of human survival. No man's land, the area between opposing trenches, was a nightmarish terrain. Barbed wire entanglements, shell craters, abandoned equipment, and often the unburied remains of fallen soldiers created a landscape of horror. Crossing this space was almost certain death, which made the Christmas Truce even more remarkable. The constant artillery bombardments created a soundscape of continuous terror. The deep, thunderous boom of heavy guns, the whistle of incoming shells, and the subsequent explosions created an environment of perpetual psychological stress. Soldiers developed acute hearing, able to distinguish between different types of shells and their potential threat. Tactical engagements were frequent but often small in scale. Snipers would attempt to pick off enemy soldiers, small raiding parties would try to gather intelligence or capture prisoners, and artillery would attempt to disrupt enemy positions. The goal was not massive territorial gains but survival and maintaining defensive lines. The First World War represented a critical turning point in military technology and tactics. Traditional concepts of warfare, cavalry charges, linear battlefield formations, were completely obsolete in the face of modern weaponry. Machine guns were perhaps the most transformative technology. Capable of firing hundreds of rounds per minute, they turned battlefield advances into potential massacres. A single machine gun nest could halt an entire battalion's advance, creating defensive positions that were almost impregnable. Artillery had also evolved dramatically. Large caliber guns could fire shells several miles, creating devastation on an unprecedented scale. The ability to strike enemy positions from great distances changed the fundamental nature of combat. Soldiers were no longer primarily fighting other soldiers but were increasingly victims of mechanized, impersonal destruction. Chemical weapons emerged during this conflict, adding a new dimension of horror. Poison gas attacks could decimate entire sections of trenches, causing painful, prolonged deaths. The use of chlorine and later mustard gas represented a fundamental violation of previous military conventions, highlighting the war's descent into total, unrestricted conflict. Communication technologies were also developing rapidly. Telephone lines, rudimentary radio systems, and advanced mapping techniques allowed for more coordinated military operations. However, the complexity of these systems often meant that tactical information was delayed or misunderstood, contributing to the war's overall confusion and inefficiency. Against this backdrop of technological brutality and systematic violence, the Christmas Truce emerged as a spontaneous, almost miraculous event. On December 24 and 25, 1914, something extraordinary happened along sections of the Western Front. As Christmas Eve fell, soldiers on both sides began to hear familiar sounds, Christmas carols drifting across no man's land. German soldiers began placing Christmas trees on their trench parapets, decorating them with candles. British soldiers responded with their own celebrations, singing traditional carols. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, something remarkable occurred. Soldiers began to call out to each other. Initial communications were tentative, a mix of broken language, gestures, and shared humanity. Some areas saw more extensive interactions. Soldiers from opposing sides began to meet in no man's land, exchanging gifts, sharing food, and even playing impromptu football matches. In some sectors, the truce was more formal. Officers on both sides recognized a mutual exhaustion, a shared understanding that the current conflict served no immediate tactical purpose. They allowed, and in some cases, tacitly encouraged, these moments of peaceful interaction. The gifts exchanged were often simple but profound. Cigarettes, food, small personal items became tokens of a shared human experience. Photographs were shown, stories were shared through limited common language, and for a brief moment, the machinery of war was suspended. Part 6, Significance, a testament to human potential. The Christmas Truce was more than a singular historical event. It was a powerful statement about human nature, a reminder that even in the most brutal circumstances, compassion and mutual understanding can emerge. For the soldiers involved, this moment was transformative. Many wrote letters home describing the experience, highlighting not the differences between them but their fundamental similarities. They were young men far from home, missing their families, united by a common experience of displacement and suffering. Military leadership was, predictably, horrified. Subsequent Christmases saw increased efforts to prevent such spontaneous peacemaking. Artillery bombardments were increased during holiday periods, and soldiers were continually reminded of their supposed differences and the necessity of conflict. However, the legacy of the Christmas Truce extends far beyond that single moment in 1914. It has become a powerful symbol of peace, a testament to the idea that human beings are fundamentally capable of compassion, even in the most challenging circumstances. The truce challenged the prevailing narratives of wartime propaganda. It demonstrated that the supposed enemy was not a faceless, inhuman entity but a fellow human being with similar hopes, fears, and fundamental desires for peace and connection. In subsequent decades, the Christmas Truce has been commemorated in various ways, through books, films, music, and artistic representations. It serves as a powerful counter-narrative to the idea that conflict is inevitable, that humans are fundamentally driven by hatred and division. Contemporary peace movements have often cited the Christmas Truce as evidence of humanity's inherent capacity for empathy and understanding. It represents a model of conflict resolution based not on force or ideology, but on mutual recognition of our shared humanity. As we reflect on this extraordinary moment in history, we are reminded that peace is not merely the absence of conflict but the active recognition of our shared human experience. The soldiers of 1914 who participated in the Christmas Truce understood something profound, that the boundaries we create are often more fragile than we imagine, that compassion can emerge in the most unexpected places. Their spontaneous act of humanity continues to inspire generations. It challenges us to look beyond the artificial divisions that separate us, to recognize the fundamental connections that unite us as human beings. In a world that often seems consumed by conflict and misunderstanding, the Christmas Truce of 1914 stands as a beacon of hope, a powerful reminder that peace is not just possible, but inherent in our shared human potential.